Hey friends, welcome back to Fantasy Awash. Today I am going to be talking about 3 trilogies that I have started and finished this year and whether or not they are worth your time. Let's jump in. So the qualifiers that I'm going to be using for each of these trilogies is what type of fantasy they are, what subgenre it is, YA, adult, grimdark, all of that stuff. Is it, in my opinion, good character development? Do I feel like there is a satisfying conclusion at the end? Because I feel like the magic often gets woven into character development and or world building, so we can talk about that a little bit. But those are what I think primarily are what we are going to be centered on today. I am going to be discussing these in the order in which I read these books. So the first trilogy that we are going to be discussing is Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. One of this trilogy is The Final Empire, Book 2 is The Well of Ascension, and Book 3 is Hero of Ages. This is an odd one to place in terms of subcategory or subgenre in fantasy. It gets classified under YA and it can sometimes be classified under adult fantasy. Now, I feel like this is fair for both of these because there are tropes within these books that definitely fall under the YA genre, specifically the romance story that kind of takes place throughout this trilogy. I don't really typically love the way that Sanderson writes romance, except for Warbreaker. I love me some Warbreaker. But in this story, I definitely feel like that is what classifies it as a YA novel, in addition to one of the protagonists being a teenager. She's 16, I believe, when the story starts. So it's not that surprising that we have a YA classification. However, some of the themes that are tackled within these books are definitely adult, and I would not classify these under YA whatsoever. We talk about abuse, physical abuse, mostly mental abuse. There is some off-screen sexual assault, sexual abuse. There are very dark and grimy things and storylines that take place in this book, and therefore I feel like it is a very blurred line between YA and adult fantasy. But if that doesn't bother you, then I think you can jump into this world and you'll be fine. In terms of character development, I think that Sanderson does a really good job at developing and fleshing out these characters. Hi, thank you. I don't think it's giving anything away in the sense that the first book of this trilogy is a heist story. Therefore, there are people that are brought on to be part of a heist team. Does a really good job of fleshing out every member of the team, of the heist, and doing it in a way that no one feels like a carbon copy of the other. Everyone has individualistic and unique characteristics. Some characters are people that are able to use magic. So we're going to talk about the magic system now a little bit for this world. So in Mistborn, the magic system is known as allomancy. Allomancy is where people can use metals to help enhance certain skills or abilities. So some people might be able to burn copper or burn pewter, burn iron, and it helps them do things like calm a room, hear better, see better, just be stronger. There are all of these different abilities, and someone who is able to utilize all of the metals is someone that is known as a Mistborn. You can only be born this way. It is not something that can be learned or developed. It is a hereditary trait that you are given by one or both of your parents. Full-fledged Mistborns are few and far between in this world. However, you learn that there are some characters that are Mistborn, and they are way stronger in terms of physically what they are capable of doing than even a regular allomancer is. I liked the way that Sanderson wrote the magic system on this world. However, I did find it a little bit tiresome and tedious when he kept saying that someone would burn this metal or burn this metal. It got to be a little repetitive and redundant. I understood by the end of the first book, let alone books 2 and 3. So that for me wasn't something that I was super enamored with while reading this series, but all in all, I'm not worried about it. In terms of whether or not this series had a satisfying conclusion, most people will tell you that they absolutely loved everything of the ending. They found it really surprising, and they call it the Sanderlanche, in that everything kind of comes into this avalanche of knowledge at the end and hits you in the face, and you're like, wow, that was such a cool reveal and everything else. I thought the ending of book 3 was fine. There were things about it that I didn't really love, and there were things about it that I didn't mind, but it was not the ending that I had anticipated going into this read. I thought that book 1 was very good. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Book 2 I thought was just out of this world good. I gave it 5 stars, and then book 3 was my lowest rating of them. I still very much enjoyed it. It got 4 stars, but I definitely had my issues with it. I found that there were some problematic things that I have discussed on my channel. If you want to know specifically, you can go and watch the videos for each of the books. I did book reviews for each one. They do contain spoilers though, so just be aware of that. I do think that this series is still worth reading. It will always hold a very special place in my heart, and that it is the series that got me back into reading, so I am grateful for that, and it is a fun read. Also, if you were wanting to read more of Brandon Sanderson, or if you feel like you don't know much about Brandon Sanderson, I think that this is a really good starting point, that or Elantris, but Mistborn being a trilogy gives you more sample size of kind of the same story. So I think that this is a good one. I do recommend it, especially if you are new to fantasy, wanting to test fantasy out. It's one that I think might be a good gauge for you. The second trilogy that we are going to discuss is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. Book 1 is Shadow and Bone, book 2 is Siege and Storm, and book 3 is Ruin and Rising. This series 100% falls under the category of YA, and there is nothing wrong with YA. YA can be great for kids and it can be great for adults. Honestly, if you like YA, there is no shame in that, and I am here to hold that flag with you that sometimes I really enjoy a YA novel. Specifically, the best novel of YA that I have read so far is actually by Leigh Bardugo, but it isn't in this trilogy. But let's talk about Shadow and Bone. This series takes place in an area called Ravka. It has been split by something called the Fold, and the character development and the magic in this series are very much interwoven with each other. We have something in this universe called Grisha. Grisha are people that can wield something that has been labeled as the small science. The small science is something that can control things like water, fire, wind, and then there are the very rare people that can control darkness and can control light. Grisha are born this way, the same way that they are in Mistborn. It is not something that can be learned or developed. However, in this world, the Grisha are hunted because they are different. It is not viewed as a blessing to be Grisha unless you yourself are Grisha, and then you are taught otherwise. But the characters in this world, our protagonist is a girl named Alina Starkov, and she is frustrating. I can see why a YA audience would maybe resonate more with her. She is very teenage, angsty in her storyline, and that part might not necessarily translate and resonate with an adult reader as much as it might a middle grade or YA reader. However, some of the minor characters and or secondary characters in this story I think are really well done, and those characters get more time fleshed out throughout the books, despite the fact that it does stay a main POV from Alina's perspective. That's fine. It's not my favorite in terms of character development. However, I really do like the magic system that Leigh Bardugo has introduced in this story, and I liked the way that she incorporated that through character development in her story. I thought that was well done and definitely deserves points in her category for that. So, as I said, this is a YA series. I went into this having already seen the show on Netflix, not both seasons, but the first season, and I thought this looks pretty good. Why not give it a try? I did end up learning not long after that a lot of the readers and lovers of the Shadow and Bone trilogy found that they had made Alina less frustrating and more likable of a character in the show compared to what they did in the books. After reading the books, I could definitely agree with this. However, I do think that a lot of the character development is good in this story, in the show, as well as the books. I didn't love season 2 of the show. You can watch that on my channel. I did a breakdown of that between the differences between the books and the show. But I thought that it was still good character development nonetheless, even though she was incredibly frustrating and irritating a lot of the time. In terms of whether or not this story is satisfying with its conclusion, I definitely found that for me personally, I was okay with the way that the trilogy ended. I feel that it makes more sense from an adult's perspective, actually looking at the final parts of that book and going, I understand why these decisions were made. I think that a lot of the audience that disagrees with that tends to be more YA based, but there is debate as to whether or not this is a satisfactory ending for a lot of these characters. I personally had no problem with it. I will say I found book 3 to be the weakest of this trilogy. I, again, similar to Mistborn, liked book 2 the best, Siege and Storm. I thought it was the most enjoyable. It had the best characters, the best character development, but these are really fast reads. So if it's something that you think you might want to try out, if you've never really read YA fantasy before, I would think that this is a good starting point. So I would also recommend Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. The third and final trilogy that we are going to be discussing is the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I love this trilogy so much, so I'm gonna tell you right off the bat that yes, I recommend this trilogy. I absolutely recommend this trilogy, but let's jump into it a little bit more. The genre of fantasy that it tends to be categorized under is grimdark fantasy. However, the author himself does not like that terminology, so we are going to say it is more adult fantasy with grimy and darker tendencies. I think that it is a great entry point for people who might want to give grimdark a try or dark and grimy fantasy a try, or people in general who just want to dip their toe into the fantasy genre, especially if they're looking for good adult fantasy. The character work in the First Law trilogy is some of the absolute best that I have ever read, if not the best that I have ever read. I loved that each character felt so human and so relatable at times, and all the while you think they are loathsome people, and I think it takes a very well-crafted author to be able to achieve something like that. I don't think many authors are capable of doing it well, and he does it with every single character in his story. So yes, in terms of character development, I would argue that this is hands down the best of the three. It's probably the best that I've ever read. So really, if you like good character development driven stories, First Law is going to be the one for you. If the story has a satisfactory conclusion, I feel like there are definitely satisfactory parts of the ending of the third book. There were a couple of parts that left me questioning why that happened or why it had been done that way, but I will recommend this series forever and ever and ever. I am now reading the standalone books of this. I just released a video last week as to my love of First Law and why you should read First Law. So if you really want to get into the full details of it, you can watch it. I will link it here. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these trilogies, if you feel like my assessment of them is correct, if it differs from yours, what makes it different. If you like videos like this, of course, you can always like and subscribe. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram where we can talk about books or my cat jumping into the video, you can find me on Instagram at FantasyAwash. And as always, I will see you next time. Bye. Hurry. Out of the way. Move along.